The night had fallen softly upon the ridges of stone and the low grass valleys, its dark veil stitched with the faint shimmer of distant stars, while the wind moved like a slow breath through the ancient trees at the valley's edge, carrying the cool scent of earth and pine toward the mouth of the cave where the wanderers had gathered. The cave rose before them like a silent throat in the mountain's flank, its entrance shaped by centuries of rain and wind until it seemed less a wound in the stone than a patient gateway waiting for voices, fire, and time to enter its long memory. They had walked for many hours beneath the fading light, their feet tracing the hardened paths where streams had once run and vanished, their shoulders dusted by the wind's dry hands, until the first shadows of the cave had offered the promise of warmth and shelter. The group carried no speech among them, only the soft weight of animal skins across their backs, the slow shift of bones tied with sinew against their belts, the faint rustle of tools carved from stone, all moving together like a single body breathing beneath the stars. When they entered, the air changed at once, the cool breath of the mountain pressing gently against their faces, carrying with it the scent of water seeping unseen through rock, of lichen slowly living on the walls, of long darkness waiting for fire's return. They placed their bundles upon the ground and began gathering wood from the thicket outside, each piece chosen for the way it would burn, the way its smoke would rise or cling, the way its heat would settle into the cave's hollow heart. The fire came slowly, coaxed from dry grass and a spark of stone upon stone, a patient birth of warmth in the circle of their hands, until the flame unfolded with a single trembling breath and began reaching upward with orange tongues that painted the walls in gold. The cave slowly brightened, the fire throwing light along its jagged edges, drawing from the shadows shapes that had been invisible before walls, curving inward like the ribs of a giant beast, ceilings blackened with the ghosts of fires long turned to ash. As the warmth spread outward, the wanderers sat close upon the ground, skins wrapped tight about their shoulders, faces brightened by the flame's soft glow, their eyes reflecting the restless flicker that turned stone into something alive and moving. One of them, a woman whose hair carried the smoke of many winters, rose slowly and moved toward the wall where the fire's light stretched like water upon uneven stone, her hands carrying a small bowl carved from antler, its surface stained with the deep color of berries and earth. She knelt where the wall curved inward and touched the rock with the back of her hand as though greeting an old companion, feeling the chill that lived beneath its surface, the unchanging heart of the mountain holding itself beneath the warmth of the flame. Others watched as she dipped her fingers into the dark mixture, a paste smelling faintly of soil and ash, and began to move her hand across the stone, leaving behind lines that glistened red before they darkened into the wall's rough skin. The fire crackled softly behind her, its smoke rising toward the black hollow above as she traced the shape of an animal upon the rock, its body long and lean, its legs stretched in motion as though fleeing across the stone toward some distant horizon. Each line grew beneath her hand with patient care, the creature's back curving, its head lowering toward the ground, the suggestion of muscle and bone emerging from nothing but shadow, earth, and memory carried in her steady fingers. The others sat in silence, their faces turned toward the growing shape, their eyes reflecting both fire and movement, as though the animal on the wall were not painted but slowly stepping from another time into the glow of this single night. a child shifted closer to the wall, her small hands resting upon her knees, the firelight soft upon her face, her breath moving slowly as the painted creature's dark legs began to thicken, to hold the weight of its imagined body upon the stone. Beside the first figure, another began to appear, drawn by the same patient hand, this one with horns sweeping backward like the curve of the moon, its head lifted as though listening to the soundless wind moving through the painted grass beneath its feet. The wall filled slowly, each stroke joining the others, until the cave seemed to hold a gathering of animals no longer running through the valleys, but frozen here in the stillness, living only in firelight and the eyes of those who watched. The painter's hand paused often, fingers resting against the cold surface, as though listening to the stone itself before the next line carried the creature forward into its silent life upon the wall. Some of the wanderers leaned against the cave's rough edges, the stone cool through the skins upon their shoulders, while others stirred the fire to keep the light alive, its glow stretching upward to meet the running shapes forming above them. Outside, the wind moved through the trees with a long sighing sound, carrying the distant call of night birds and the soft creak of branches touching one another, like slow speaking voices beyond the cave's mouth. The painter stepped back at last, the bowl empty, her hands stained dark, the creatures upon the wall seeming to breathe in the shifting light, their bodies caught between motion and stillness, life and memory, stone and flame. The child watching them felt the warmth of the fire upon her face and the cool breath of the cave behind her, the two meeting upon her skin like day and night, sharing the same small piece of time. No one spoke, for the firelight filled the silence with its soft restlessness, and the painted animals seemed to carry their own unspoken language, a story without words moving through the room like a low, endless river. The painter washed her hands in a shallow pool near the cave's edge, the water dark and cold, rippling softly where her fingers passed, as though erasing the stain of earth, while the shapes upon the wall remained untouched by time or tide. The night deepened beyond the cave, the stars leaning nearer, as though to watch the firelit gathering, their light faint against the stronger glow within, where people and painted creatures shared the same small chamber of stone and warmth. Some lay down upon the packed earth beside the fire, eyes closing slowly, the day's long walking falling from their shoulders like dust shaken from a cloak, leaving only the drifting nearness of sleep moving through their bodies. The creatures upon the wall kept their running motion, yet never left the stone, their dark lines unmoving though the fire gave them breath, as though waiting for more eyes, more nights, more lives to pass beneath their silent watching. The cave held them all together, the wanderers, the fire, the painted memory of animals beneath its patient roof of stone, while outside the wind traced its long, invisible paths through the sleeping valleys under the slow, turning sky. And when the fire's last embers settled into a deep, red glow, the cave returned to darkness, carrying within it the creatures born of soil and flame, waiting through the long night for the next hand, the next fire, the next remembering eyes. When the first pale edge of morning touched the mountains, the cave still held its secret warmth, the soft breath of embers turning the air gentle and smoky, while the painted creatures waited upon the walls as though guarding the dreams of those who slept below. The night had passed without hurry, carrying the voices of owls through the trees and the faint rustle of small animals moving beneath the undergrowth. the sky rolling its endless stars across the darkness like distant sparks beyond reach. One by one, the wanderers stirred, rising slowly from the ground where skins had kept them warm, their movements quiet, as though unwilling to wake the silence that held the cave in its soft, patient hands. The fire was little more than a glow, red as the inside of fruit, its light falling faintly across the stone floor. Yet it carried enough heat to push back the chill that waited at the cave's dark mouth. The painter of the night before sat with her back against the wall, eyes half closed, the dried color still dark upon her fingertips, as if the shapes she had given to the stone would not leave her hands entirely. She looked toward the creatures now caught between shadow and fading light, their lines softened by smoke and distance, as though they belonged not only to the wall but to the breath of fire and the slow turning of time itself. Outside, the early air lay cold upon the valley, brushing over the grasses that held beads of night water upon their tips, each droplet trembling as the first faint wind moved through the open places between trees. The wanderers stepped out into that pale beginning, their feet pressing the earth still damp from the night's quiet hours, the smell of soil and water rising to meet them with a freshness that made the lungs deepen their breathing. The mountains rose on every side, their shoulders dark against the slow brightening sky. The streams winding like silver threads through the lower ground where the deer sometimes came to drink when the world was still half asleep. One man knelt beside the stream's edge, dipping his hands into the moving water, feeling the bite of its coldness climb along his arms before lifting handfuls to his mouth, the taste sharp and clean as he swallowed. Others followed, kneeling in silence, washing faces and arms, their skin quickening beneath the water's chill, hair darkened by wetness, while mist drifted along the edges of the stream like low smoke waiting for the sun to scatter it. A child laughed softly when a small fish darted between the rocks near her feet, its body flashing briefly before vanishing beneath a stone's shadow, the sound of her voice carrying lightly before falling quiet again among the trees. The painter watched the sky as she drank, its colors spreading slowly, the black giving way to deep blue, then to the faint rose and gold that seemed to lift the edge of the earth itself toward the coming day. She thought of the animals on the wall behind her, of their stillness within the cave's dark skin, and wondered whether the morning light would ever reach them, or if they belonged only to fire and shadow forever. When the sun broke the line of the farthest ridge, its first warmth touched the tops of the trees, turning their leaves a trembling gold, while the valley below filled with light that moved like water across the open ground. The wanderers gathered their things slowly, wrapping skins over shoulders, tying bundles with cord made from twisted plant fibers, the sound of their preparation quiet as the wind moved through grasses taller than the child standing among them. They left the cave behind without words, following the narrow paths where stones pressed sharp against the soles of their feet, the trees standing close on either side as though listening to their slow passage deeper into the valley. The air smelled of sun-warmed pine now, of earth drying after night's cool touch, of distant water falling somewhere unseen, a thin silver voice threading through the thicker silence of leaves and branches around them. They carried spears tipped with stone, not lifted in readiness, but resting easily in hands that had shaped them from river rock, fire, and time. The shafts polished smooth by palms, and seasons passing over them again and again. The painter walked near the back, her eyes moving over the trees where birds leaped from branch to branch, their feathers catching light as they turned, voices sharp and quick against the softer sounds of wind and steps. She carried with her a small piece of red earth wrapped in leaf and fiber, its weight light yet certain, the color dark enough to call forth the shapes of animals again when night and fire returned together. By midday the sun pressed heat upon the valley, drawing the smell of resin from broken twigs beneath their feet. The wanderers pausing in the shade of a rock outcrop, where wind cooled the sweat along their arms and faces. They shared food gathered days before, dried meat, roots dug from riverbanks, berries wrapped in leaves, eating in silence, broken only by the sound of chewing, the soft shifting of feet, finding comfort against the warm ground. Above them, a hawk turned in circles, so wide and slow, it seemed to belong not to the sky alone, but to the slow breathing of the valley itself, its shadow sliding over trees and stone before vanishing against brightness. The child watched it with narrowed eyes, her hand lifting as though to catch its far shape between thumb and finger, the bird's distant cry falling once through the heated air, before the wind carried it farther down the ridge. Later they rose again, shoulders bending beneath the weight of bundles, feet carrying them toward a place known for water, deep enough to hold fish through the longest summers, its edges lined with reeds and wide flat stones for sitting. The painter walked a little apart from the others now, her thoughts turning toward the cave left behind, toward the painted creatures waiting in darkness, their lines holding a memory no wind or sun could take away. She wondered if others would come when the wanderers moved on, whether the firelight would one night fall again upon the shapes running across stone, or if centuries would pass with only bats and dripping water for company. The path narrowed through stands of birch where the white trunks shone like pale fire in the sunlight, leaves whispering above them in voices that seemed to speak of rain, though the sky carried no sign of clouds. When they reached the wide water near evening, its surface caught the sky's late colors in trembling gold and rose, the reeds leaning slightly where fish moved unseen below, the air heavy with the smell of mud and flowering plants. They built small fires along the shore, smoke rising in thin blue threads above the water, the light settling softer now, turning the faces of the wanderers calm as they sat watching the fish break the surface with sudden silver mouths. The painter washed her hands again, though no color stained them now, only the memory of red earth lingering in her mind as she let the water run cold across her palms before shaking it away into the darkening air. Night came without haste, spreading its deeper blue across the valley, until the first stars shivered into view above the black lines of trees and hills. The fires along the shore glowing brighter as though answering the sky. The wanderers lay near those flames as the crickets began their steady voices among the reeds, while the painter sat awake a little longer, shaping the next animals in her mind, where no wall yet waited for them. She imagined their running bodies across stone not yet found, their eyes bright with the borrowed light of future fires, their silent presence holding the nights of people still unborn, their hooves and horns carrying time itself along the walls. And when she finally lay down, the earth warm beneath her back, the stars turning slowly above, the thought of those unseen paintings drifted with her into sleep, like the faint smell of smoke carried on wind through the dark. The morning returned with pale gold light stretching slowly across the wide water, where reeds leaned over its still surface, the air carrying the faint scent of smoke from the night's fires, now reduced to small circles of gray ash among the stones. Mist lifted where the stream entered the lake, curling into soft shapes before the sun's warmth thinned it, while birds called among the trees, their voices weaving through branches like threads of brightness drawn against the silence left by sleeping bodies. One by one, the wanderers rose from the ground, brushing bits of grass from their skins, shoulders stiff from long travel yet moving without complaint, their faces turned toward the warmth spreading slowly through the valley, as though they trusted its quiet return. The painter sat for a time at the water's edge, watching fish move like shadows below the surface, her fingers tracing shapes in the mud beside her knees, lines of horns and hooves melting as the damp earth collapsed under its own weight. She thought of the cave far behind them, of the painted creatures left in firelight silence, their still bodies waiting through endless darkness for the next flames to wake them again, though she knew it might be lifetimes before any returned. The wanderers ate little before leaving, only dried roots and berries softened in water, the taste earthy and faintly bitter, though hunger among them carried no complaint, only the slow, patient manner of those who have never expected abundance. They moved along the valley's narrow path as the sun climbed higher, its warmth loosening the chill that clung to the grass, its light striking the river in wide flashes where the water bent and turned between dark stands of trees. Spears tapped lightly against their shoulders as they walked, the heads of stone catching small sparks of sun through the branches, while children carried bundles of wood gathered the night before, the smell of resin rising from broken twigs in their arms. By midday they reached the lower slopes where cliffs rose in broken steps above them, the rock faces streaked with pale lichen and patches of moss that glowed green, where thin streams of water slid downward from heights hidden by trees. Here they stopped to rest, the shade cool against their skin, the air heavy with the smell of wet stone and leaves slowly decaying beneath last season's fallen needles, a deep forest smell older than any among them could remember. The painter knelt beside one of the trickling streams, drinking from her hands, the water tasting of metal and rain, carrying the faint coldness of snowmelt from ridges still white where the sun's warmth could not reach before evening. A boy near her ran his fingers along the damp rock, scraping away moss to reveal the darker stone beneath, its surface slick and cold, catching sunlight in thin silver lines where the water ran over the edges. He laughed softly when a small salamander slid from beneath the moss, its body glistening like wet clay, its tiny feet gripping the rock as it vanished into another crack where shadows kept the stone forever damp. Above them the sky shone hard and clear, the air warmer now, carrying the hum of insects among grasses grown tall along the slopes, their stems rattling faintly whenever the wind pushed across the valley floor far below. When they moved on, the path narrowed, bending between great shoulders of rock where only thin slivers of sunlight reached the ground. The air cooler here, smelling of stone, dust, and roots gripping deep into cracks no foot had ever touched. The painter paused beneath one overhang where the wall curved inward like the beginning of another cave, her fingers brushing the stone's surface, as though listening for what stories might sleep beneath its pale and silent skin. She carried always the piece of red earth wrapped in leaves, the weight against her side reminding her of nights before firelit walls, of creatures born from memory and ash, their shapes keeping watch while wind and time moved outside. The others passed slowly beyond the narrow place, their voices low, their movements softened by the shade, until even the children walked quietly, as though the closeness of stone pressed the air into something requiring gentler breath. Later, the path climbed higher through scattered pines, their needles thick underfoot, releasing a sharp, sweet scent whenever a step crushed fallen branches, the wind slipping through their high crowns in voices that shifted and turned but never truly broke. Here the valley opened again, the sky wider, the sunlight spilling across stone and grass, where the land tilted toward distant ridges blue with haze, the air carrying the dry warmth of afternoon across the open wind-bent ground. The wanderers stopped at a spring bubbling from a crack in the hillside, its water clear and cold, spilling into a shallow pool lined with smooth stones, dragonflies flashing green and copper as they circled above the glimmering surface. They drank slowly, filling carved wooden bowls that taste clean against their tongues, and washed dust from their arms and faces. The water running back to the earth darkened by its brief touch before vanishing among the roots and grasses. The painter sat apart, shaping again in her mind the figures not yet drawn, their bodies running across walls unseen, their hooves lifting dust that was not real, their lives belonging to firelight yet to be kindled in some other cave. She imagined antlers wider than outstretched arms, imagined the lines of muscles caught in the moment before leaping, imagined the breath of painted horses turning to smoke when flames danced before them in nights not yet come. The sun leaned westward while they rested, its heat softer now, the light turning the grasses pale gold where wind moved across them, long waves bending and lifting as though the valley itself breathed beneath the wide, turning sky. When they rose again, shoulders bearing tools and skins, the air carried the smell of crushed herbs from plants stepped upon, their scents sharp and sweet beneath the steadier resin smell of pines standing like dark pillars across the slopes. The path curved toward cliffs streaked with iron-red stone, where birds nested in cracks, their cries echoing faintly, wings glinting silver, as they rose into the sunlight before vanishing against the brighter edges of sky beyond the ridges. Evening found them near another cave, its mouth smaller than the first, half hidden by leaning birches whose pale trunks caught the fading light, leaves whispering together above the dark entrance where cool air drifted outward to meet the day's warmth. They gathered wood while children fetched water from a nearby stream, its surface red with sunset colors trembling between rocks. The smell of wet soil rising as footsteps disturbed the softer earth along its edges where reeds bent low. When firelight filled the cave at last, its walls glimmered damply, their surfaces uneven yet smooth enough in places for the painter's hands to move. Her bowl of red earth opened, the color thickened with water and a little ash. The wanderers sat quietly while the first shapes began to appear, her fingers tracing the curve of bison shoulders, the long bodies of running horses, the spreading antlers of deer whose eyes held the fire's restless reflection in their painted darkness. Smoke drifted toward the ceiling where stone blackened slowly, carrying with it the smell of burning pine and the faint resin sweetness released whenever sap within the wood found flame, each crack of fire echoing softly against the hollow walls. The painter worked until creatures filled the stone around her, their bodies overlapping in running motion, lines rising and falling like breath across the uneven surface, the fire casting them forward as though they would leap free at any moment. The wanderers lay down, one by one, as the night deepened, the air cooling near the cave mouth where stars now shone above the black lines of birch and pine, their light faint beside the fire, yet steady and countless beyond. The painter set aside her bowl when the last figure stood finished, her fingers stained again with earth and ash, the creatures upon the wall running nowhere, yet carrying in their silence the memory of all who watched them being made. Sleep drifted slowly over the cave, while embers fell into red dust, the walls keeping their gathered animals alive only in shadow and stone, waiting again for another fire, another night, another turning of faces toward their silent motion. Morning crept gently over the hills where the cave's mouth opened to the valley below, its light sliding like thin gold cloth over grass still damp with night, while smoke drifted faintly from the last embers hidden within the darkened hollow. The wanderers rose slowly from the ground, their skins carrying the smell of ash and warm earth, their bodies stiff with sleep, but moving with the unhurried certainty of those who belong to the long pace of seasons rather than hours. Children searched the ashes for unburnt wood, finding pieces still black at the edges but solid within, stacking them carefully in silence, as though even the smallest movements belonged to some rhythm older than memory itself. The painter knelt before the wall where animals had run in firelight the night before, her eyes following the curve of each horn, the press of each hoof, the lines meeting and crossing like rivers gathering in unseen valleys. She thought of how the creatures would vanish into darkness now, their bodies waiting behind the day's sunlight, their legs frozen mid-stride until flames returned to wake them in shadows trembling with smoke and the crackle of pine wood. When they left the cave behind, its breath of cool air followed them a little way into the birches before fading beneath the growing warmth of morning, the trees holding sunlight in their new leaves like thin cups brimming with gold. The path led upward along the ridge where wind moved through the grasses in slow waves, bending each stalk before lifting it again, carrying the faint sound of water from somewhere below where streams gathered between shadowed stones. The wanderers walked in silence, broken only by the soft clatter of spears against shoulders, the faint shuffle of leather cords holding bundles tight, the wind's low voice moving through pine branches high above the narrow trail. At midday they reached the ridge's crest, where the land opened before them in wide folds of grass and rock, the horizon stretching farther than any eye could follow, blue with distance and the smoke of unseen valleys beyond. Here they rested beneath a lone tree whose roots clung to the ridge like fingers, its shade trembling as wind shifted through the branches, the air carrying the warm smell of sap and the sharper scent of crushed grass beneath them. The painter sat apart on a stone overlooking the valley, shaping lines in dust with the end of a stick, horns and hooves appearing beneath her hand, only to vanish when the wind rose again and carried the loose earth away. She thought of the caves behind them, of walls dark with the memory of firelight, of animals wading through centuries where no footsteps came, their eyes holding the glow of flames burned down to nothing long before. The others ate, while resting berries gathered from bushes near the stream, strips of dried meat softened between teeth, water lifted in cupped hands from a small skin carried since morning, and spoke little beneath the wide, unmoving sky. When they moved again, the land sloped downward through scattered pines where needles carpeted the ground so thickly that footsteps made almost no sound. the air sharp with resin, and the faint sweetness of cones lying broken among roots. The trail followed a creek whose water slipped over stones with a steady sound that echoed softly between the trees, its surface catching sunlight in thin silver lines before folding them again beneath fallen branches and leaning shadows. A child bent to touch the water where it ran shallow and cold, pulling back with a quick breath at its chill before laughing softly. The sound carried downstream where it broke apart among rocks and low wind. By late afternoon they reached open ground where grass grew tall and yellow, bent by the wind into long furrows pointing toward distant hills dark with heavier trees, the air here warm with the smell of sunlit earth and seed. The painter walked near the back, her fingers brushing grasses as she passed, their dry tips scattering pollen that drifted like pale smoke around her arms before vanishing in the air, slowly cooling toward evening. When they stopped again, it was near a stand of oaks whose roots split the ground into ridges of moss and stone, the leaves above broad and heavy, holding the day's last light along their high edges. They built fires as the sun lowered itself behind the far hills, the smoke climbing through branches in long gray ribbons, the smell of burning wood mixing with the heavier scent of damp earth rising as night gathered slowly across the valley. The painter opened her bundle of red earth again, mixing it with water in the hollow of a stone, the color deepening as she stirred until it carried the smell of iron and the faint bitterness of crushed roots added for thickness. She chose a slab of rock leaning beneath the oaks, its surface pale and unmarked, and began to trace the first slow lines beneath the firelight, while others sat watching with faces bright in the growing dark. The shapes came gradually near, with their necks lifted as though listening bison broad across the shoulders. A long line of horses, following one another, as though crossing some distance, measured only in smoke and turning flames. The fire threw their shadows across the trees, where leaves shivered whenever wind moved through, so that painted bodies seemed to walk among branches, to leap between trunks, to vanish and return as flames bent and rose again. Children watched with heads tilted against their mothers' shoulders, eyes half closing, though they fought sleep, unwilling to leave the moment when stone, fire, and moving hands joined together to call life from dust and shadow. The painter worked until her fingers ached, until the bowl lay empty beside her, until the creatures gathered beneath the oaks in silence, their shapes turning slowly as flames leaned toward the night wind sweeping across the open grass. The wanderers slept where fires warmed the earth, their bodies curled beneath skins smelling of wood smoke, their faces quiet as though the painted animals kept watch, their silence deeper than the voices of wind moving across the dark hills. Above them the stars appeared, one by one, between branches, cold and countless, while the fires below burned red and patient, holding back the long darkness only at the edges where trees and night pressed close together. The painter lay awake a little longer, listening to the fire crackle, to the low breathing of sleepers, to the leaves shifting above, as though speaking in a language older than words, older even than stone marked by painted hands. When at last she closed her eyes, the creatures on the rock remained behind them, their bodies caught in the stillness between flame and darkness, waiting for the next night, the next fire, the next eyes to look upon them again. Dawn came slowly, its first light stretching across the valley like pale smoke from a dying fire, touching the tops of trees before sliding down to the roots where sleepers still curled, beneath skins holding the faint smell of ash and pine. The wind moved softly through the clearing, lifting corners of woven grass mats where embers glowed faintly, the earth warm beneath the fires that had burned all night, their last thin flames licking upward before folding into dark red silence. One by one, the wanderers stirred, shaking the stiffness of sleep from their shoulders, the morning air cool on their faces, their breath rising pale before them, as though each exhale carried something older than language into the waiting light. Children gathered twigs for the fires again, bending low where yesterday's flames had left only blackened wood, their small hands careful as though touching the memory of heat still sleeping beneath the ash-softened ground. The painter rose slowly, her fingers stained with the dried red dust from the night before, her eyes moving first toward the oak-sheltered rock where painted animals waited in silence, their bodies half-lit by morning sliding through the branches. She traced the air before them without touching the stone, following the curve of a deer's lifted neck, the sweep of its horns, as though some part of her sought to carry their stillness forward into the day's long journey. When they left the clearing, the fires were left behind to smolder beneath wind-stirred ash, thin smoke rising in threads that vanished almost as soon as they formed, as though the night itself exhaled one last breath before disappearing. The trail narrowed between trees heavy with the scent of sap, their trunks dark from early mist, their roots crossing the path like ribs beneath thin soil, the earth cool and damp where moss drank from unseen water below. The wanderers walked with steady rhythm, feet moving through needles and leaves softened by rain, their silence broken only by the low call of birds waking far above where branches tangled the sky into fragments of pale, changing light. As the sun climbed higher, the air grew warm, and the smell of wet earth gave way to resin. The sharp sweetness carried through the trees each time wind shook loose a cloud of pollen drifting like faint yellow smoke. They passed beneath cliffs streaked with minerals, where water had carved long paths down the stone, their surfaces rough and bright in places where quartz caught sunlight, edges glittering briefly before folding back into the shadows, pooling at their bases. The painter slowed here, her eyes following the colors locked in stone, the red of iron, the pale lines of chalk, the dark seams running through rock like veins holding stories pressed tight across ages longer than memory could reach. She chipped a fragment from one low ledge with a rounded stone, the sound ringing softly before falling silent, and held the piece in her palm, where its red dust left a faint stain like old blood across her fingers. The others watched only briefly before moving on, their bundles shifting against their backs, the trail ahead opening again through grasses taller than a child's head, where wind bent each stalk like waves moving toward a far unseen shore. Here the sun lay heavy on shoulders and hair, its warmth broken only by the occasional drift of cloud that cooled the air for a moment before sliding away, leaving the land bright and endless once more. They stopped near a stream winding through low ground where willows leaned close over water, running clear and cold between stones, their roots twisting downward as though drinking the same silence carried by the slow current beneath them. Some knelt to fill skins while others splashed their faces, the sudden chill lifting small gasps of breath into the air, the stream carrying each sound away among reeds trembling where dragonflies balanced with wings shining like glass in sunlight. The painter sat apart again, the stone fragment turning slowly between her fingers, its roughness catching against her skin as she imagined the lines it might draw when night returned and firelight opened the walls of yet another silent shelter. When they moved again, the land rose gradually, the stream falling behind, the air thinning as the wind grew stronger along the slopes where scattered pines stood alone among rocks, their trunks twisted as though shaped by years of listening. From the crest they saw the next valley spread below, its floor broken by dark pools of marsh water where reeds shivered, its far edge lifting into hills whose sides glimmered faintly with the pale stone faces of more cliffs. The wanderers descended slowly, the grasses whispering against their legs, the marsh air carrying the smell of water thick with roots and insect wings, the ground soft beneath their steps, where moss clung to patches of standing water among reeds. They followed a narrow path along the drier edge, the sun lowering behind them so that their shadows stretched long across mud and shallow pools, the air cooling again as evening gathered itself from hollows and tree-lined edges of water. When they reached the far side, cliffs rose before them, streaked with the same iron-red stone seen earlier. But here caves opened like mouths along the base, their dark entrances holding the cool breath of places sunlight never touched. The painter's eyes lingered on the nearest opening where wind moved faintly through, carrying the smell of stone damp with centuries, the air inside already gathering the first thin smoke from torches lit as night pressed closer around the hills. They entered slowly, their footsteps echoing where walls narrowed into a single passage leading inward before widening suddenly into a chamber, whose ceiling arched high above like a frozen wave caught mid-rise before falling toward the dark floor below. Here fires were built again, their flames painting the walls with gold that flickered across surfaces waiting like blank skins, the air warming with the smell of burning wood, with resin bubbling from branches stacked along the edges of flame. The painter mixed red dust with water in a hollow stone, her movements slow, deliberate, as though the night itself had been waiting for this, for her hands to carry shapes out of silence and onto the skin of the cave. She began with lines running close together, the first shape a bison heavy along the shoulders, its back curving beneath horns lowered toward some unseen wind, its legs braced as though holding against the weight of storms pressed into stone. Others gathered behind her, their faces lit by fire as though the creatures themselves threw back the glow, the walls brightening where each new line rose to meet the last, until bodies stood beside one another in painted stillness. Children leaned close, their shadows crossing the walls, so that animals seemed to move beneath them, the fire's unsteady light turning each figure into motion before stilling again when flames dropped lower with the slow burning of wood. The painter worked until the last dust was gone, until the shapes filled the wall like a herd crossing some endless plain carried only in memory, their bodies waiting again for night, for fire, for the next eyes to find them. The wanderers slept there beneath the painted cliffs, the fires burning low, the air carrying wood smoke, and the faint breath of the cave itself. Its silence deeper than the wind outside, where night animals moved softly through the dark grass. Stars turned slowly above the hills, while shadows lay unmoving along the valley floor, the world holding its breath around the sleepers, as though time itself waited for morning to scatter them outward once more across the ancient land. The night stretched softly across the valley, its darkness folding over the earth like layers of velvet, while the wanderers moved slowly along the stony trail, their steps muffled beneath the weight of shadows and the smell of cooling dust. Above them, the sky unfurled its countless stars, each one burning faintly with a cold, silent patience, casting a pale silver light upon the river stones, the drifting grasses, and the slumbering silhouettes of the hills beyond. The wind, carrying the sharp scent of pine resin and the faint bitterness of distant fires, moved gently between the travelers, weaving through their hair and clothing, touching their skin with a chill that clung but did not bite. Somewhere ahead lay the cave whose walls whispered of things older than memory, where painted shapes awaited the glow of torches to breathe again across the rough surface, their colors dulled but not erased by the centuries' unhurried hands. The wanderers carried their fire carefully, cradled inside a hollow of bark and ash, a single glowing ember breathing with them as they crossed the open land, each flicker of orange keeping back the weight of night's long silence. When they paused beside a low ridge, the air was thick with the smell of stone, water, and roots buried deep beneath the soil, while the soft sound of wind in the grass rose and fell like a slow chant. They settled near a cluster of rocks where the ground dipped gently, a natural hollow shaped by forgotten rains, and there they lit a small fire whose smoke curled upward like a hesitant hand reaching for the indifferent stars. Its light warmed their faces, turning cheekbones to copper and eyes to dark pools that reflected the flames' slow dance, while beyond the fire's circle everything faded again into formless shapes where the night pressed close. The youngest among them watched the sparks lift into the air, their brief flight tracing lines of light across the dark before vanishing, and the others followed his gaze with quiet minds, feeling the fire's warmth and the night's breath together. An elder, his shoulders wrapped in the hide of some long-vanished beast, stirred the flames with a blackened branch, the embers shifting like tiny hearts within the growing bed of heat as he murmured low words no one else repeated. The smell of smoke mingled with the faint sweetness of dried grass and the sharper resin of pine, while the fire's crackle filled the spaces between the wind's soft movements and the steady breathing of those gathered around its glow. Beyond the firelight, the hills watched in silence, their ridges shaped like sleeping animals against the faint starlight, their slopes falling into shadows that hid streams, stones, and the winding tracks of creatures passing unseen through the night. When the travelers ate, it was slowly tearing pieces of roasted roots and dried meat softened by the heat, their hands moving carefully, the warmth of food rising faintly against the air that cooled steadily as the hours drifted onward. The youngest traced shapes in the dirt with a charred stick, lines that curved and twisted beneath his hand, faint echoes of the painted figures they would see again when the morning firelight reached the hidden walls. His lines wove animals with long legs and sweeping horns, birds with wings spread wide as though caught in the wind's invisible hands, and the others watched the pictures form without speaking, the crackling fire the only voice among them. Somewhere far off, a night bird called, its sound thin and reedy, threading through the air with a lonely clarity before fading again into the silence where the hills swallowed everything slowly, as though nothing truly left or arrived here. The elder's eyes, reflecting the fire's glow, seemed to carry both the closeness of the flames and the distance of stars, as though memory itself sat behind them, shaping the slow rhythm of the journey and its quiet halts. He told no stories tonight, though his voice sometimes rose like it might carry words. falling again before shaping them, as though the firelight and wind spoke clearly enough, and the night needed no other language to be understood. The smell of smoke settled into the wanderers' clothing, into their hair, into the hollow places of the stones, where warmth lingered faintly, as though even the earth wished to keep some memory of the fire's brief presence here. Above, clouds moved with a drifting softness, their edges glowing faintly where the moon pressed through, scattering light like thin milk across the hills, across the travelers, across the faint trail waiting beyond morning's slow return. When sleep came, it came gently, folding over them in the warmth of cooling stones and fading flames, carrying them where dream and darkness met in silence, while the ember's last glow held the night a little farther away. The hills kept their watch, as always, the wind moving across them with patient hands, the stars shifting only slightly as the hours passed, and the faint smell of ash rising like a memory from the fire's quiet heart. In the distance, unseen in the night, the cave waited where walls carried shapes born of other hands, where the colors of earth and firelight waited for the next travelers to kneel with their torches and wake them again. By dawn, the ashes would gray beneath the first thin light. The wind would smooth the traces of sleeping bodies from the dust, and the wanderers would rise slowly, carrying their fire onward across the waiting land. The trail ahead would take them toward the cave's deep shadow, where painted animals and the marks of forgotten voices waited, where the fire's glow would stretch again across stone walls, older than the memory of any living breath. Yet for now, the night remained whole, the hills unbroken, the fire a single pulse of warmth within the great dark, holding the travelers in its circle, while the wind and stars moved quietly beyond its fading light. Morning unfolded slowly across the hills, the first pale light stretching itself thin over the ridges, where stones glimmered faintly with dew, while the air carried the faint smell of cooling ash where the fire had burned through the night. The wanderers rose in silence, their movements slow and heavy with sleep, the sound of shifting leather and crackling grass joining the whispers of wind. Their faces glowed faintly beneath the widening light, eyes still softened by dreams, while the elder stirred the ashes with a charred branch, releasing a faint spiral of smoke that drifted upward before disappearing into the growing brightness above. The smell of yesterday's fire clung to their hair, their clothing, even their skin. A mingling of resin, earth, and warmth carried with them like a memory as they began gathering their few belongings for the day's slow journey ahead. Somewhere beyond the next ridge, the cave waited in its silence, its walls holding colors drawn from earth and plant, its darkness shaped by the hands of those who had come long before the travelers, now moving toward its shadowed mouth. They carried the ember carefully, resting in its hollow of bark and ash. A living thread of warmth passed from one hand to another, its faint orange glow breathing softly against the gray fingers of the fading morning fire. The youngest walked beside the elder, watching the slow movements of his hands, the way he shielded the ember from the wind's cold touch, as though protecting a heartbeat too fragile to survive the long crossing of open hills. The path wound upward along a slope where thin grasses shivered in the wind, their tips catching the early light in silver threads, while beneath them the soil crumbled softly under the weight of bare feet and the pressure of time itself. Birdsong floated faintly from a cluster of trees beyond the ridge, each note carrying the freshness of dawn, while the sky brightened slowly above the hills, its pale blue deepening toward the horizon, where clouds stretched like thin veils of smoke. When they reached the ridge's crest, the travelers paused to look across the valley below, where a river bent like a silver ribbon through the stones, its surface glimmering beneath the sunlight, now spilling fully across the open land. The air smelled of water and cold stone drifting upward from the valley floor, mingling with the sharper scent of pine rising from the slopes, while a faint breeze carried grains of dust that caught briefly in the light before vanishing. They descended slowly, the ground softening underfoot as grasses thickened near the river's edge, where the smell of damp earth grew stronger and insects hovered in drifting clouds, their faint buzzing blending with the murmur of the moving water. Here the elder paused, kneeling beside the river's edge to cup the cold water in his hands, letting it spill across his wrists and face, the surface breaking softly around his reflection before smoothing itself again into unbroken silver. The others drank in silence, feeling the chill spread through their bodies, washing away the heaviness of sleep, while the youngest splashed the water against his arms and chest, the drops catching sunlight like tiny shards of glass before falling away. The river moved steadily past them, its voice low and patient, carrying fragments of leaves, thin branches, and the pale shapes of stones turned smooth by years of slow turning beneath the current's endless hands. When they left the water's edge, they followed a narrow path climbing toward the valley's far side, where cliffs rose like dark walls against the brightening sky, their surfaces streaked with red and ochre where rains had carved shallow channels. The cave lay somewhere within those cliffs, hidden where shadows gathered even at noon, where the air cooled sharply beneath overhanging rock, where firelight would soon reach across walls untouched, since other hands had left their shapes upon the stone. The climb grew steeper as the sun lifted higher, its warmth pressing against the wanderers' shoulders, while dust rose around their feet with each slow step, carrying the dry smell of crushed leaves and the faint bitterness of sun-warmed soil. They stopped where a narrow ledge pushed outward from the cliffside, a place of wind and height where the land below spread open in every direction, rivers and ridges stretching toward a horizon pale with distance and light. Here they rested, laying their few belongings in the thin shade of a leaning boulder, the youngest sitting cross-legged near the edge where he watched a hawk circle far above the valley floor, its shadow sliding silently across the stones below. The elder unwrapped the ember's small cradle, feeding it with dried grass and slivers of bark until the faint glow deepened into a trembling flame, its warmth gathering in the wind's thin fingers before settling into steady breath again. Smoke drifted upward along the cliff's surface, its gray lines curling briefly before vanishing into the brightness above, while the fire's warmth moved gently across the wanderers' faces as they leaned close to its fragile center of heat and light. They ate what remained of their food, roots roasted over the small flame, their taste carrying both the sweetness of earth and the bitterness of ash, while the wind moved slowly across the ledge, lifting strands of hair and folds of worn clothing. The youngest traced again in the dust, his fingers drawing the curve of horns, the slope of running legs, the widening wings of birds, shapes repeating themselves as though waiting for the cave's walls to give them color and permanence. The elder watched in silence, his eyes following the slow movements of the boy's hand, the way each line grew and branched, like the memory of something half seen in dream or shadow, something the firelight would later wake in stone. Beyond them, the valley slept beneath the noon sun, the river glinting as it turned around the base of the cliffs, the grasses bending in the wind's invisible path, the hills fading into the pale distance where earth met sky. When they rose again, the fire was left to fade on the ledge, its smoke thinning into nothingness above the cliffs, while the wanderers gathered their things, lifted the last ember, and began the final climb toward the waiting cave. Shadows deepened as they approached the overhanging rock, the air cooling around them, carrying the smell of dust and stone long hidden from the sun, while the mouth of the cave widened slowly before them like a silent, watching eye. They paused at its threshold, where sunlight fell sharply against darkness, where the wind's voice faded and the smell of ancient dust drifted outward, as though the cave itself exhaled the long memory of everything it had held inside. When they stepped into its silence, the air closed around them with a stillness broken only by their breathing, by the faint crackle of the torch as the elder fed it with dried grass until its flame leaped bright against the walls. The light reached slowly across the stone, glimmering on damp surfaces where water had traced thin lines over centuries, moving toward the painted shapes waiting farther within, shapes the wanderers had come to wake beneath the trembling firelight. And behind them, the valley lay empty again beneath the turning sky, the wind moving softly through grass and over stone, carrying away the last traces of smoke, footsteps, and voices as though they had never passed this way at all. Night deepened slowly outside the cave as the last light of day retreated beyond the hills, leaving the valley washed in shadows that gathered softly beneath the trees and along the quiet edges of the river's darkened path. The wanderers moved gently within the cave's shelter, their figures outlined faintly by the flickering fire, which threw thin, trembling lines of gold across the walls, its smoke curling upward to rest among the dark hollows of stone above. The painter crouched close to the flame, grinding fragments of ochre and charcoal against a flat stone, the powder rising in faint clouds of rust and black that smelled of iron and earth, when the warmth of the fire stirred them lightly into the air. A child watched her hands as they moved slowly, the palms darkened by pigments, the fingers streaked with red and brown, each motion deliberate and unhurried, as though the act itself was a quiet song sung between hand, stone, and firelight. The elder sat near the wall where the painted shapes already ran bison with their heavy shoulders leaning forward in motion, deer with thin legs stretching toward unseen grasses, birds rising on wings stilled in a single permanent sweep of pigment. His gaze followed the figures carefully, eyes tracing each line as though memory itself had shaped them. And in his stillness, the fire's glow reflected faintly, making it seem as though his thoughts carried the same light as the flame itself. The air smelled of smoke, warm stone, and the faint musk of hides laid on the floor for sleeping, mingled with the sharper scent of crushed berries and damp soil gathered earlier from the valley's edge. When the sun had not yet fallen, one of the wanderers knelt near the entrance where the wind pressed softly through the narrow gap, carrying the cool breath of the darkened valley, its edges lined with the calls of night insects and the faint rustle of grass beneath moving air. She lifted her face slightly toward the wind, eyes closed, the chill sliding gently across her skin, bringing with it the scent of pine and distant river water, carrying reminders of the day's warmth fading now into quiet shadows outside. The fire cracked softly, a small spray of sparks rising before falling back among the embers. And the painter leaned closer, mixing water with powdered pigment until it thickened into color, deep and warm as fresh clay turned in the hand. She pressed a hand against the wall, palm flat on cold stone. Fingers spread as though feeling the earth's slow pulse through its hardened skin, then lifted the first smear of color to shape the curve of a new animal's flank. The elder watched her work in silence, the lines growing beneath her hands, each stroke smooth and steady, carrying the shape of memory and movement, the echo of hooves through grasslands, now held in stillness upon the cave's quiet walls. Children leaned closer to see the figure forming, their faces lit faintly by the fire, their breath carrying warmth into the cool air, eyes following the slow birth of another creature rising among those already gathered in pigment and shadow. The night outside deepened further, the wind softening until only faint currents slipped through the valley, carrying the smell of water, moss, and the faraway sweetness of flowers folding slowly into themselves beneath the moon's pale silver drifting overhead. One of the wanderers stirred the embers with a length of wood, coaxing the flames higher for a moment, so that the walls glowed brighter, revealing the painted shapes as though they moved beneath sudden light before sinking back into quietness. The painter's hands moved steadily, dipping into the dark mixture, spreading color along the rock, the curve of horns taking form beneath her fingertips, the legs stretching outward in lines that seemed to tremble faintly in the fire's flickering breath. The elder shifted slightly, his shadow bending across the wall, so that, for a moment, it merged with the painted animals, his shape folding into theirs, until it seemed the living and the painted share a single motion held in two worlds. Someone placed a bundle of dry grass near the fire's edge, the faint crackle rising as it caught, sending pale smoke upward with the smell of scorched stems, its brief light revealing the damp sheen of pigments still wet upon the wall. A child yawned softly, curling on a hide near the wall where warmth from the fire reached without harshness, his eyes drifting half-closed, yet watching the shapes as though the animals might step quietly into life before sleep claimed him fully. The painter paused to mix more color, crushing another fragment of ochre against the flat stone, the sound low and rhythmic beneath the soft breathing of the wanderers and the fire's occasional whisper as wood shifted among glowing embers. She worked slowly, as though the wall itself required patience, each stroke considered, each line holding weight beyond its form, so that the finished creature seemed drawn from both memory and dream, from hunt and story, from silence and flame. The elder reached for a skin of water, drinking slowly before passing it to the next, the gesture quiet, the movement carrying the ease of long habit, the water's coolness drifting faintly through the warm, smoke-scented air surrounding the group. Outside, the moon lifted higher above the valley, its silver light sliding across trees, rocks, and grasslands, touching the river where it bent through darkness, a thin gleam winding softly like a pale snake across the sleeping earth below. The wind carried the faint call of night birds from the trees, their voices brief and distant, answered by silence stretching across the hills, a stillness broken only by water moving over stone where the river narrowed far beneath the ridge. The painter stepped back at last, looking at the shapes together, the older figures darkened with years of smoke and soot, the new one shining faintly where wet pigment caught the light, its legs stretching as though it would leap beyond the wall. The elder's eyes followed the curve slowly, and he nodded once. the motion slight but filled with the weight of approval, the fire reflecting softly in his expression, as though the animal itself carried flame within its running shape. A woman placed another log upon the fire, the sparks rising again, drifting upward until they vanished near the cave's dark ceiling, leaving behind the sharper scent of new smoke curling through the warm breath of air above their heads. The painter sat at last beside the others, her hands streaked with color, palms stained dark, the mixture drying slowly upon her skin, while her gaze remained on the wall where the animals ran together, old and new in shared motion. The children whispered softly about the shapes, their words low, as though not to wake the painted creatures, and soon their voices faded into the crackle of fire, the hush of wind at the entrance, the breath of night itself surrounding the cave. The elder closed his eyes, listening to the rhythm of flames and wind, to the faint movements of those settling upon hides, to the distant river carrying moonlight along its surface beneath stars gathered like cold embers across the sky. The painter leaned against the wall, feeling the stone's coolness at her back, the warmth of fire at her front, her body balanced between heat and cold, shadow and light, the memory of movement and the stillness now settling around them. Night held them softly, the valley stretched silent beyond, the animals frozen in pigment, yet alive within the minds of those who painted, watched, and dreamed beside firelight that flickered like a heart beating quietly at the center of the cave. The first light of morning slipped slowly over the hills, touching the tips of trees and the edges of stones. While the wanderers stirred beneath the last shadows of night, the air carrying the faint warmth of embers gone cold. They rose with care, bodies stretched and rubbed free of stiffness, the smell of dew and damp earth mingling with the lingering scent of smoke and resin. While the youngest yawned and ran fingers through hair damp with night's cool breath, the path ahead wound between stones softened by centuries of rain, each step stirring the smell of moss and crushed pine needles, while the wind carried distant whispers of water and hidden birds whose voices threaded the hills with gentle rhythm. The elder guided the travelers along low ridges, where the sun's first heat-kissed shoulders and the ground radiated faint warmth, while shadows shifted slowly over the land, as if remembering the slow passage of countless seasons. Somewhere below, a river glimmered faintly through reeds, its voice soft and persistent, carrying the memory of stone and sediment in endless motion, while above the cliffs the air held the subtle temps of iron and dust pressed into centuries-old rock. The painter walked last, her hands brushing the air as if touching something unseen, imagining the shapes of animals that had once lived here, their bodies hidden in distant valleys, but returning briefly in memory, drawn again across the mind's quiet walls. They paused at a narrow ledge overlooking a field of tall grasses, their tips bent like waves beneath the slow wind, carrying the smell of earth and drying seed, the ground beneath feet soft with soil and the faintest traces of fallen leaves. The ember was carried forward in a hollow of bark, its warmth fleeting but real, a small pulse of life against the vast stillness surrounding them, its glow reflected in eyes that had learned to see fire as both guide and guardian. The youngest knelt beside a stone to trace lines in dust with a finger, a tiny echo of the painted shapes awaiting within the cave, while the wind moved gently across the ledge, lifting dust in soft clouds that drifted like silent smoke. They descended slowly, carefully, feet pressing into soil softened by night's moisture. Each step mindful, the elders' hands, guiding hands that had known both the rough bark of trees and the smooth stone of riverbeds long worn by water's patience. The air grew cooler as they neared the cave's mouth, its darkness thick with the memory of centuries, carrying the faint scent of minerals and stone. The whisper of distant water and the subtle undertone of earth pressed beneath eons of wind and rain. The entrance widened to embrace them, shadows stretching across walls that had held the hands of those who came long before. Shapes carved in memory and pigment, waiting for the warmth of firelight to awaken them once again. The painter set down the ember, coaxing it to life in a hollow stone, feeding it gently with dried grasses, the glow spreading slowly across the chamber, casting moving shapes upon walls rough with time, the air fragrant with smoke and earth. Others gathered around the small flame, their faces lit by its glow, the heat pressing softly against skin chilled by the cave's long shadow. While children watched quietly, eyes wide in reflection of the flickering fire as it traced shapes on stone. She began again with lines drawn in red and ochre, a bison heavy across shoulders, a deer mid-stride, a bird spreading wings as if ready to leave the wall for the space beyond, the pigment smelling faintly of iron and wet clay. The firelight danced across their faces and the walls, the shadows moving with every flicker, lending a breath of motion to creatures frozen in stone, while the elder murmured quietly, shaping the rhythm of their movements and the hush of awe filling the chamber. The youngest traced his own small lines nearby, the edge of a stick leaving faint marks that echoed the shapes she drew. And for a moment the cave seemed alive, filled with whispers of memory, with breath of those who had been here long before. Outside, the wind stirred among rocks and trees, carrying the faint scent of distant river and pine, while the moon climbed slowly toward the sky, pale and patient, its light pressed softly against the cave's outer edge, where shadows bent and softened. The painter worked with care until the pigment bowl lay empty, the fire dying slowly in its hollow stone, the figures standing quietly on the walls, as if caught mid-breath, waiting for eyes to return once again and see the life pressed into color and shadow. The wanderers gathered close as the fire faded, the air cooling around them, carrying the scent of smoke, stone, and wet earth, while silence pressed into the chamber with a softness that held the memory of every touch, every hand, and every quiet breath spent here. They lay close together on furs and moss, shoulders touching in the warmth of gathered bodies, the eldest watching the last sparks vanish, the youngest curled near the soft edges of light, the cave holding them as though it remembered their every footfall. Outside, the world waited in patient stillness, the hills holding their quiet against the sky, rivers moving slowly beneath trees, and wind drifting lightly over stones, leaving only faint traces of movement and the smell of earth, as though the night itself had exhaled and fallen asleep. And in the cave, the painted animals remained, their shapes solid and eternal beneath the glow of memory, the smell of red earth lingering faintly, the walls keeping their secrets, and the echo of firelight like a quiet pulse in the long darkness. The first light of dawn seeped slowly through the cave's mouth, brushing faint gold across the walls where painted bison and deer rested in quiet stillness, their outlines softened by centuries of shadow, yet catching the sun's pale warmth as if waking from a long, patient sleep. The wanderers stirred gently among furs laid across the stone floor, stretching limbs stiff from hours spent near the fire. The faint smell of smoke and damp earth clinging to skin and hair, while the cave exhaled a cool breath of morning into the chamber. The youngest knelt carefully beside the painted bison, fingertips tracing the curve of a horn pressed into red and ochre pigment, feeling the rough stone beneath his skin and imagining the life that once moved across distant plains, now captured forever upon the wall. The elder watched silently, the lines of his face softened in the fire's last glow and the morning's pale light, eyes tracing the animals' forms as though memorizing each slope of shoulder and spread of wings, preserving them within the quiet chambers of memory. Outside, the valley stretched wide beneath the rising sun, the river winding like silver through stones and reeds, carrying the faint scent of water and wet grass upward, where the wind brushed softly across the cliff's edge, pressing a cool kiss to the wanderers' faces. The painter stirred the last embers of the fire, coaxing them into a small glow that brushed faint light across the walls, illuminating figures both new and old, as though the cave itself had held its breath, waiting for this quiet acknowledgement of life and history. Children leaned closer to the wall, their eyes reflecting the gentle warmth of the flame, and whispered softly among themselves, voices blending with the faint hissing of smoke and the subtle, constant rhythm of the stone beneath them, carrying the heartbeat of a place much older than their own lives. The air smelled of earth and mineral, of resin and cooling stone, mingling with the faint, sweet hint of dried berries brought from the valley, a subtle perfume that wrapped around them like a memory pressed into time, grounding them in the present while echoing the past. One of the wanderers ran a hand along the wall, feeling the subtle ridges of painted pigment beneath fingertips, tracing the outline of a deer midlip as if urging the motion forward, while the cave's shadows danced softly around them, shadows shaped by centuries and the flicker of firelight. The elder rose and stepped toward the entrance, the stone cold beneath his bare feet, and paused to look across the valley, inhaling the crisp air and the faint, distant smell of pine and river water, letting the coolness mingle with the lingering warmth of the fire. The youngest touched the surface of a painted bird, following the curve of wings with small, careful fingers, while the painter added a final stroke to a bison's flank, each motion slow and deliberate, preserving the rhythm of life captured in pigment, stone, and memory. Outside, the wind moved softly over grasses and stones, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and the distant perfume of flowers bending beneath the sun's first touch, while the river glimmered faintly, reflecting the pale sky above and the subtle movement of cloud and light. The fire sputtered faintly in the hollow stone as the last ember released its heat into the cave, the warmth lingering softly against skin and stone, while smoke drifted slowly upward, curling against the ceiling and fading into the cave's shadowed hollows. The wanderers ate slowly, their fingers brushing against one another as they shared pieces of dried fruit and roasted roots, the taste carrying both sweetness and earthiness, a reminder of the valley's generosity and of the careful work required to gather sustenance from a world still untamed. The elder's voice murmured softly, in rhythm with the fire, recounting stories of animals and rivers long vanished, of hunts carried across hills and plains, the words weaving a gentle connection between past and present, grounding the wanderers in the quiet pulse of life beyond the cave's walls. The painter set down her pigments at last, hands streaked with ochre and charcoal, and sat near the fire, letting the warmth brush across her face while the children leaned close, eyes wide in quiet awe, absorbing the soft memory of each creature that had been brought to life on stone. The cave seemed to breathe around them, inhaling the smoke and exhaling the cool, stone-scented air that carried faint echoes of footsteps, hands, and voices long vanished, a silent witness to every ember, every movement, every quiet breath taken in its shelter. Outside, the valley held a soft stillness, the river winding through reeds and stones, birds lifting briefly on pale currents of wind, and grasses bending in patterns shaped by centuries of sun, rain, and passing feet, all carrying the faint memory of hands pressed to stone. The wanderers rose together, stretching arms and shoulders, letting warmth from one another and the final glow of embers hold them steady against the cool morning, while the elder guided them toward the cave's mouth, each step measured, quiet, and reverent. The youngest reached to touch a painted hoof once more before stepping away, fingers lingering against the roughened stone, tracing the line as though carrying it forward into the memory of the day, into the valley, into life beyond these walls, and into time itself. The painter carefully lifted the last ember, cupping it in bark and feeding it small dry grasses, letting it glow faintly before settling, the fire's warmth echoing softly across the walls one last time, casting shadows that seemed to bow gently to the shapes resting on the stone. The elder stepped forward, hand brushing along the wall, fingertips grazing pigment and stone, and exhaled softly, a gesture of quiet thanks to the cave and to the long lineage of hands that had pressed life into its surfaces, keeping memory alive in color and form. Outside, the sun climbed higher, spilling gold across the valley, touching stones, reeds, river, and grass in gentle illumination, while the wind moved softly, brushing across shoulders and faces, carrying the scent of pine, river water, and distant flowers into every breath they took. The children ran their fingers along the edges of firs and rocks near the entrance, pausing to watch dust drift in beams of sunlight, and in their eyes reflected the quiet fascination of shapes held in stone, the weight of stories, and the slow heartbeat of memory preserved in pigment. The wanderers emerged fully into daylight, shoulders brushing against one another in warmth, eyes following the curves of hills and river below, carrying within them the glow of firelight and the echo of painted forms, a quiet knowledge pressed into body, mind, and heart. The elder paused on the cliff's edge and face, inhaling the valley's scents, feeling stones beneath feet, and exhaled slowly, allowing the weight of years, fires, and hands long gone to settle into calm acceptance. The painter lifted her gaze to the horizon, tracing shapes of distant hills and forests, the light brushing softly across her cheeks, carrying the memory of animals caught in stone and pigment, of firelight, smoke, and quiet companions who had shared this small world with her. The youngest bent to touch grass, wet with morning dew, small hands cupping the scent of earth and water, eyes reflecting sunlight, and whispered softly to no one, the sound carried only by wind and shadow, a quiet acknowledgement of life, memory, and the journey they had shared. They began to move slowly along the ridge, each step measured, careful, carrying water, furs, and memory, letting the firelight remain within them, an ember pressed into heart and mind, faint but enduring as they moved across hills and valleys shaped by both time and shadow. The cave stood behind them, its mouth resting in shadow, the painted animals holding still in the glow of memory, while smoke, dust, and breath lingered faintly in air, waiting for another ember, another hand, another quiet heart to awaken them once more. The valley below stretched infinite and calm, river winding silver between hills, grasses bending in the breeze, stones warmed faintly by the sun, carrying the echo of footsteps, hands pressed to stone, firelight, and the gentle rhythm of wanderers moving slowly through time. And the wanderers walked on, carrying the memory of firelight, stone, pigment, and shadow in their bones, in their breath, in the quiet of hearts, leaving only faint traces on earth, air, and mind, as the world waited patiently, timeless, and unbroken beneath sky and sun.